Sometimes we come across scriptures that are so personal. They tap into our life in ways that are quite earth-shattering, quite gobsmacking. That's what this scripture is for me this week. I've been looking forward to it for a couple of weeks to preach on. Last week, I moved us into Paul's letter to the Corinthians because I said I wanted to combine the gospel last week with the gospel this week because they're part of the same story, and I don't understand why sometimes the lectionary makers split it up because it has to go together to make sense. So all week I've had bits and pieces of what I've wanted to say in my mind, and now I'm getting to the point where I'm just not quite sure how to address this because it is ridiculously personal to me. I want to show you someone. Um, that's me. Um, don't mind the topic and everything else. They used a stock photo from 1988 to put into a 1990 article. That's back when town newspapers existed. I had the privilege when I was 18, 19 years old to be asked to be the youth representative of the region where I lived, the church region, on the national stage, which was big. For me anyway, small town girl who was trying to figure out what this calling was that God had for me. And then the really, really big thing happened. See, that year, the council was discussing human sexuality. This is back in the early days of gay and lesbian acceptance in the church. However, the journey is still going on today. But this was like brand new. It was just barely being talked about in '88. And the conversation, the question in this really special group was, should being gay or lesbian be a reason to not be considered for ordination? That's all the question was. And I was asked to be the youth representative on this committee. It was fantastic. My ego was overjoyed. I was getting all sorts of attention. And the picture that I showed you, these books right here, I had two binders that thick of petitions that I had to go through. Now, just to contextualize you for a little bit, I was from the North Shore, New Brunswick, 18 years old, more naive than I can possibly put into words, had no idea up until that point in time that I knew anybody who wasn't straight. I've since come to find out that one of my good friends that I went to high school with was gay. No clue. Nothing at all. I had nothing to work with, no idea what I was supposed to do. But I remember being at the preparation weekend for this big council meeting, and a couple of ministers came up to me and they said, well, we know what you're going to do. You speak for us. And I'm like, okay. One of them, I remember, put his arm around me. His name was Donald. I mean, that's how much the experience has affected me. He put his arm around me and he said, you know what you're supposed to do, don't you? I probably answered yes. I didn't have a clue. We got to the council meeting early, and days early. Our committee was meeting 3 days, I think, before council even started, and council was a week long. So that was a 10-day session that we were part of. At the end of things, after having met people right across the country, of various orientations and interests and inclinations, who looked at me like the young kid I was, who needed to be educated, as I was, we came to the decision as a committee. It was unanimous. All the people on the committee right across the country agreed. And there were two other people from my region who were part of this. I wasn't the only one. The three of us were also part of this 40-person agreement that said that human sexuality, being gay or lesbian, should not be a reason to automatically stop ordination proceedings. That's all we said. That was the intent of the conversation. The council that year accepted it. It became known. Media did their thing and reported badly. By the time I got back to where I grew up, it was a gong show. I was surrounded by people who were angry with me, who told me I had brought AIDS to the church, because that was the period of time that was going on, that decided that I was devil incarnate. I had some death threats. Death threats. Me, 19, death threats. It was just wild. And all of these people who had been so supportive and so encouraging of me as this teen golden girl, and I really was the golden girl, faded into the woodwork. They were not there. So here I was in my continued naivety, because even though I learned stuff in 10 days, 10 days is not a long period of time. In my complete naivety, my misplaced trust, I was thrust upon the stage, the spotlight was on me, and everything negative that they could possibly come up with was heaped on me. That's part of my story. I can't not be the person who was affected by that. My view of the church cannot help but be affected by the betrayal of these people who had watched me grow up, who put their arm around me, who told me they had believed in me. That is my story that I come to this passage with. This sense of being disavowed, disappointed in the people you grew up around. So where is the gospel when we get here? Well, there's a few things to put in context, since we're taking two gospel sections and putting them together. First of all, what is the year of Jubilee? What is the year of the Lord? So in Hebrew tradition, there was this year of the Lord, this Jubilee year. Every 7 years, sabbatical, the Sabbath, something was supposed to be done around the area of rest. But every 50 years, the Jubilee years, it was supposed to be economic justice. All the land that had been borrowed or that had been given as payment for something reverted back to the people who originally owned it. Prisoners were set free. Slaves were released from slavery. Servants were released to go about their lives. All economic issues were brought down to zero. There was no money exchanged. Everything was supposed to rest for this Jubilee year. Even the land was supposed to rest. Now, historically, there is absolutely zero evidence that this actually took place, but that was the dream. That was the understanding that Isaiah was giving in Isaiah 61, and that's what Luke 4 is quoting. And Isaiah, that part of Isaiah was written during the Babylonian exile, where the elites from Jerusalem and Judea, the rich folk, had been taken away into Babylon. The poor still had the land and they were doing what they were doing, but the elites were gone. And they were crowded and housed together and came up with this notion of the Jubilee year and a whole lot more that we take for granted as the Hebrew tradition came out of this period in Babylon with a bunch of learneds, a bunch of priests and educated people who were just sitting around trying to put the walls in and the decorations in on the faith that would eventually be the Hebrew tradition and morph eventually into Judaism. So it was not a lived experience. It was a dreamed experience. So here we have Jesus sitting in his hometown. Now he's just come out of this temptation with the devil. He's just come out of being baptized. He's done a few things. His reputation is there. It's getting around. And he is sitting in the synagogue where he grew up. This is probably the place where Mary chastised him for running around. This is the place where he would have been carried in as a baby to meet the people. This is a place where his buddies were there. They would have talked about all sorts of teenage stuff while he was growing up. These people knew him. These people thought they knew him. And they were counting on him. I mean, this was someone who had done great things. This is the homeboy who had made good coming back to visit them. And just like most communities, the ones who are most engaged are also the privileged within that community. So in the synagogue, he would have been right up there front with all the rich people, all the powerful people, all the ones who were the movers and shakers of the community. And they would all be paying attention with this big grin on their face. This is the son back, the son whose reputation precedes him. We have him now. So he would read from the Torah. Read from the scrolls. It wasn't the Torah. It was part of the prophetic parts, and he read about the Jubilee, about the justice, about the um, returning of prisoners, and there would probably be a lot of nodding because remember, these are people in Galilee under Roman occupation. These are not people who are free, no matter what the social strata is, no matter how much money they might have. The Roman government was still ultimately in charge of what's going on and could wipe them out the next day if they decided to. So they really, really liked the message of releasing the prisoner, letting the captive go free. They loved that. Then it got to the part of proclaim the Jubilee year. And that would have been, yes, great, let's do that. And then Jesus sits down and says, it's been decided in me. I represent the Jubilee year. Talk about overstating your position. This human boy that they knew, that had become a man, was now telling them that he was the embodiment of the long-awaited justice that they wanted. Now, justice, remember, is economic. So anybody who had money had to give it back. Anybody who had land that they didn't originally own had to give it back. Anybody who invested in anything was not going to be paid back. The whole idea was economic justice. It was redistribution of wealth to the people, not redistribution up to the elites, which is what our system in modern capitalism and what the system that the Romans were under had happened. This is not the way they wanted to hear the good news, that they had to change, they had to give up their luxury. And here's Jesus sitting amidst them, saying, I am going to make that happen. I am the one that shows the embodiment. The promise has been made good today. It wasn't going to go well, and I think Jesus probably knew that. Because he very quickly got in the face of all of these people. And he knew what was going on. Don't be pretending that Jesus didn't know he was stirring the pot. Of course he did. He started to tell them about the time of Elijah and the time of Elisha, two prophets who made these miracles happen for people outside of the Hebrew world. Worse than that, he made it happen for people who were in the land of Canaan. The people who were before, that God was supposed to give the land to the Israelites and take it away from the Canaanites. Here's Jesus saying God sent these great, great prophets to the Canaanites. And then he said, people all around here, they're going to get my healing, but not you. Homeboy, he was supposed to do wonderful things. He was supposed to put them on the map. He was supposed to bring whatever their reputation was and make things better for them. And he didn't. He sat among them and told them things they didn't want to hear. You know, sometimes I look at the way church approaches stories like this and the gospel in whole. And sometimes it amazes me how the complicated is made to be simplistic and the so simple is made to be complicated. Because the more complex you make something that is simple, the less you need to deal with simple. Jesus is preaching a lesson of economic justice to people who are comfortable. That's the same message of economic justice that is told today to people who are comfortable, and we don't want to hear it, because what that means is we lose our comfort. In order to have justice, in order for the poor to raise, the wealthy have to lose. It's not possible any other way. The wealthy cannot keep their absurd riches with the poor coming up. They just can't. And Jesus spoke this message of economic justice. And he spoke it to the people who thought knew him. They were so enraged. They dismissed him. Isn't this Jesus, Joseph's son, like the carpenter? Like what? Why is he telling us anything? They were even talking about throwing him off the cliff, potentially to his death. Jesus walked right past, walked right through, was not going to be sticking around for that, but it did not take away from the anger of these people. And it does not take away from the anger that we would feel too if the church actually preached the gospel. See, the thing is, the institutional church is the comfortable class. They're the privileged class. The comfortable church, the institutional church, is the church that has to give things up. The people in the pews have to give things up in order for God's justice to be realized. And no one wants to do that. What would it mean for a person whose entire pension is invested somewhere and then they're told that pension is gone because the investment is not going to be honored anymore? Or people who have put their entire money into this business and the workers say, you know what, we're not willing to work for slave wages anymore. We're gone. That one's actually happening right now. People are not happy. Justification all over the place for why it's the problem is the workers' fault and not the system. See, Jesus knew the system was a problem, and he gave us a new way of doing things. He gave us an opportunity to say, here is the Jubilee year. But accepting that is threatening to the comfort of so many people. We like the theory of Christianity. We like the bells and whistles of the church and the ceremonies and the holidays and the food and everything else. But the real nuts and bolts of the gospel, the real message that Jesus wanted to tell us, we resist because no one wants to lose their comfort. No one wants to be that family who has to use the oven to heat their apartment, potentially starting a fire like we saw in New York not that long ago. No one wants to be the family where the mother and father are working shift work and they still cannot make ends meet. So they have to go into the food bank and they have to look for other social organizations to cover just the basics. Their kids won't get new shoes. They're lucky if they get third-hand shoes. If you're comfortable, you don't want to live that life. You think your comfort protects you from that life. But the more you rely on your comfort, the more we are separated from what God says is going to happen and should happen. The whole idea of Jubilee, the whole idea of economic justice, is to make it good for everybody. Not great for some and bad for others, but good for everybody. Do we have the bravery to be those people who can look at Jesus and say, you know what? It's not going to be easy, but we're going to do it. We're promised heaven. We are promised the new world once everybody gets on board and starts to work together. But we've let too many things get in the way. The Gospels call us today, just like they did 2,000 years ago, to do it differently, to do it better, to make it work. And you know, the prophets are still not really respected in their hometowns. Never have been, won't be. But it doesn't mean the prophets are not right and that we need to do something different. Do we have the bravery to really follow Jesus? That's a big question.